Huh. Whoa. I guess we all have nightmares sometimes. That was one of them a couple weeks ago. But have no fear, the SL600M is here. Good people, so I'm actually quite excited about the CL600M despite the weird naming scheme, because this is finally something totally fresh from Cooler Master. This is not an upgraded iteration of what they previously launched. This is like a totally new direction for them. Nope. That ripped. The new Enermax Lick Fusion is their first addressable RGB all-in-one cooler with a standard 240mm rad and absolutely beautiful RGB ring illumination on the fans and the pump to highlight that unique flow indicator through the transparent top. Check out the Lick Fusion down below. Alright, so the SL600M from Cooler Master to me is a really interesting release because it's almost like a new direction from Cooler Master. They clearly have a new designer who was like, enough with this RGB stuff, let's stick to something a little bit more mature. And I appreciate that because like from a design perspective, this is a gorgeous case that kind of stands out from the rest of the Master case lineup and stands out from the rest of the cases on the market right now. You know, this beautiful, very tall aluminum piece in the front and the top, this beautiful new mesh material that looks absolutely gorgeous for the top, and the new I/O they have there with the new motion sensor, so as you hover your hand around it will light up those USB ports, which by the way has a USB Type-C Gen 2 port. So overall it's like a really nice looking package, but the downfall is the price point. So here I understand they're trying something new in terms of design and also the interior features, but at $200 you have to ask yourself, who is your target audience? And I know they're pushing their whole marketing thing towards work and play, so this could be a gaming system and could very well fit inside an office environment or something that isn't gaming oriented. But at $200 you're competing with the likes of the Evolve X from Fantex, provided you can actually get one since they're all sold out. You know, the Define S2 just came out from Fractal Design and that is $50 cheaper, yet, you know, functionally it seems to offer a bit more even. And so the $200 price point I feel like is the downfall of the SL600M. And even if you take a look at Cooler Master's own cases like the H500M, which is also a $200 enclosure, it has more fans that are RGB, more glass panels, more features, like all types of tooling that is required, so I don't understand why this case is so expensive. I do appreciate the new direction with the aluminum pieces, it's absolutely gorgeous. However, the aluminum is so thin, you know, once you tap on it, you can hear the plastic that is underneath it. You know, you tap on the Evolve X, it sounds metallic. Here, it sounds plastic. Now, having said that, I feel like Cooler Master has done a good job in terms of combination of plastic, steel, and aluminum pieces so that the thing looks amazing, but when it comes to like feeling the case, it doesn't feel as premium for the price point. For the side panels, we have nice capped thumb screws at the back, and both side panels utilize the hinge approach that allows the panel to almost like, you know, hang off the frame. But here with the glass panel, because it's so heavy, the actual metal joint or the piece that is attached to the glass is glued on, and that glue has started to come off. So when I was removing the panel, I heard the crackling noise of the glue peeling off, and that is not a good thing on a $200 case. Now, it doesn't happen with the other panel because it's steel, so it's much lighter versus this giant glass panel. Now, Cooler Master have confirmed they have fixed this issue for mass production on the factory level, and now the glass side panel can withstand 20 kilograms of tension for that metal hinge and the glue, so that's nice. The bottom is covered in the large dust filter removable from the back, and as you can see, it is foldable, and that is to allow you to remove the filter even if you don't have that much space behind the case, which I appreciate. The one thing I don't like about the frame is that you cannot pick it up by the front, only by the sides, because that front facade is so magnificent and tall, but not exactly functional. It just looks pretty. Of course, all the aluminum edges are refined, so you're not going to cut yourself. They're super smooth, and I do appreciate the outline of the Cooler Master logo at the front. It's subtle, and the branding is not being, you know, it's not screaming at you, and I appreciate that. And the only Cooler Master text we see is on the side, inside the power supply shroud, which looks nice and elegant, I like it. Now, one of the most interesting things about this enclosure is Cooler Master's decision to remove any rear exhaust fan. As you can see, we have 9 PCI slots plus 2 vertical and an absolutely solid panel where you normally find a rear exhaust fan. And that is because as we enter inside, you can see the power supply shroud area has been totally relocated from the bottom traditional space to the side beside the motherboard, therefore clearing up all that space underneath. And this is where we have 2 included 200mm fans. And Cooler Master is trying to create this chimney effect by having airflow generated at the bottom, which is why the case is so tall. You can totally fit like my entire fist underneath there, which is good. So there's enough spacing there for those fans to intake air, and they push everything through to the top, and the top has no fans included. But with this nice little bracket, you can install up to a 360 rad and dual 200mm fans. I do like that the top panel is also spaced out to allow for airflow to exit freely, and you can also install fans above the frame, which is awesome. The top plate can also be removed completely. It is toolless, and it can also be slightly raised to allow for that additional gap of airflow if you do have fans that are above the frame, which I think is helpful. And since we don't have the traditional hard drive cage and the actual power supply shroud at the bottom, storage has been kind of moved around everywhere. So we have 2 SSD slots on the power supply shroud on the side. Behind the case, we have 2 more SSD caddies in their conventional spots. And then we have 2 of these interesting drive brackets that can be used for SSD mounting or hard drive mounting or any of your water cooling components. One is located on the rear fan slot where that usually is found, and another is located on the power supply shroud. Furthermore, we have 2 more additional drive brackets behind the front panel that is not easy to access, by the way, but is easy to route because the power supply is right there. And it's interesting to see these drive brackets are mounted on a fan bracket, so they're clearly recycling this frame, but of course you cannot mount any fans there because that entire front panel is completely closed. The case supports eATX motherboards, but only up to 272mm because anything above that in width will totally cover your rubber grommets. However, you can use the additional rubber grommet beside the power supply shroud to route, let's say, a 24-pin cable or SATA cables in that matter. So you have a little bit of options, but cable management for anything other than ATX motherboards will be a challenge. And that is, of course, because the power supply shroud basically is located on the side of the motherboard, and we have that rail system. And I find that entire like repositioning of the power supply onto that area pretty refreshing, and like working with it, it's not like frustrating. You just have to remove the first piece, and then we have the rail system, which is finally coming into effect, kind of like being useful, versus in the past it's only been used for hard drives and like water cooling components, but now you can finally use it to mount power supplies, which is pretty awesome. And depending on the power supply length, you can reposition the actual main mount higher or lower, also depending if you're mounting a 360 rad up top or not. Then we have the additional second piece that basically collects all the cables and prevents them from going into the rest of the bottom of the case. And I find that whole thing works really well. You just mount the power supply, mount the second shroud kind of to hide all the cables, and you also have the ability to mount it on the rail system depending on how tight you want the cables to be or slightly loose. As for the bottom fan bracket / grill, so that no cables get through and make contact with those fan blades, we have 2 200mm fans which are not RGB, and they spin at maximum 800 RPM. You can replace that with up to a 360 rad, so that's good if you're looking for water cooling. And I find that whole airflow section at the bottom and the top is actually pretty good because the power supply shroud is totally out of the way. The motherboard is pretty high up, so you have plenty of space there for push-pull, thick radiators, no problem. And to recap our cooling options, you can do a 360 up top, 360 at the bottom, dual 200mm fans at the bottom and the top, and dual 140 mils at the top and the bottom. And then we have to talk about this whole chimney effect of having that fresh air delivery from the bottom passing through your GPU onto your CPU cooler that has to be mounted facing up. And that is one kind of concern for me, because in my previous experience with certain AMD motherboards, you were not able to have the flexibility of mounting the cooler in either horizontal or vertical orientation. So you have to take that into account if your motherboard supports it and if the cooler supports it as well. And the second thing I was thinking is that yes, hot air rises and we have all that fresh air from the bottom, but it is passing through the GPU first. So any air that gets to the CPU cooler will already be hotter based on the GPU temperatures. I also would love to see a compatibility list from Cooler Master to let users know of what motherboards work and what coolers work, so that you're not necessarily thinking, oh, this is going to be great for my system, and then only realize that either your mount or the CPU cooler does not support vertical orientation. That would really suck. Luckily for my Noctua U12S cooler, I have no issues rotating that to be facing up. But for my RTX 2080 Ti, I did have to remove the additional bracket that is on the power supply shroud because it was slightly pushing down on the GPU, and maximum of GPU clearance until the power supply shroud is 318 millimeters. So I think it's exactly the length of this GPU because it's very tight. It's not making contact with the shroud, but it is very close. The one thing you could do is remove the secondary shroud from the power supply to reveal all your cables if you need that additional space. But yeah, otherwise you have 318 millimeters. As for cable management, absolutely no issues here. Rubber grommets in all the appropriate locations, and I do like that secondary shroud at the bottom that is attached to the fan bracket that allows you to pass all the cables for the bottom of the motherboard cleanly without them actually being revealed underneath the motherboard. Awesome. Now the GPU can be mounted in multiple locations. We have our standard horizontal one that probably is not the best for the CPU temperature, but the GPU definitely gets all that fresh air. Then you can relocate the GPU to the vertical two slots, which are closer to the side panel window. So probably not ideal because the GPU gets kind of hot there, but more fresh air gets delivered to the CPU because the GPU is not blocking that. And then we can rotate the main PCI bracket window, is what they call it, so that we can have all our primary PCI slots in vertical orientation instead of horizontal. And the advantage of that is having multiple GPUs in horizontal orientation, therefore potentially giving you better GPU temperatures because of all that additional fresh air from the bottom, and it's not going to, one of them is not going to be blocking the other if they're positioned horizontally. And the interesting thing about mounting the GPUs in vertical position is that there's nothing holding the GPU at the bottom. So the actual riser cable just attaches to the bottom of the GPU and into your motherboard. It's not actually being supported at the bottom. And that actually makes sense because that way it frees up all that room at the bottom for potential radiators. And we have plenty of room there for, radiator and push-pull setup. And I understand why they did it, but you also have to be very careful not to ship the system like that because the GPU otherwise is just being held in by those PCI slots. And for the $200 price point, the master accessory riser cable is not included. So you have to go out of your way, buy the accessory separately so you can take advantage of the whole point of this enclosure of having the GPU mounted vertically for that chimney effect so that the air can actually get to the CPU cooler. Why not include it? You're already paying $200. And so here's my temperature chart with the default orientation when the GPU is horizontal. This is when it's the coolest. Of course, all that fresh air is being delivered right there, while the CPU suffers with much hotter temperatures. The GPU vertical with near glass gets slightly hotter, but more air gets to the CPU. And GPU in the middle, we definitely get better GPU temperatures and the same CPU temperatures as when the GPU is near the glass, simply because the same amount of air gets the CPU cooler. But when we look at temperatures across the Define S2 and the C700M, sure, the GPU is the coolest out of the three cases, but the CPU temperatures suffer so much simply because we don't have that additional fresh intake towards the CPU cooler because it's just getting the warm air from the GPU. That, of course, is a big negative. I also want to mention that going with RGB in here didn't really make sense because it doesn't really suit the taste of the enclosure on the exterior and the interior. So I populated the Lian Li streamer cable inside, and yeah, it looks fine by itself and like a gaming case, but in here doesn't really look that well. And also, let's say mounting the Enermax TB RGB fans, which look fantastic elsewhere, but here I mounted them at the bottom and they're not exactly visible. And so this case, if you're trying to go with lighting approach, is good to light up the interior with illumination instead of other RGB components. And so to conclude, I want to say that, I'm happy to see Cooler Master is trying to think outside the box in terms of design elements. They absolutely nailed it here. And I understand why they cannot have an entire motherboard being rotated, because that would make the case much longer, because that's where the power supply shroud is, and they would have to kind of redesign that entire structure. And so I understand all these limitations, and also appreciate the new modular approach for the PCI window bracket, but it only benefits the GPU and not the CPU. And for the next iteration of this case, because you know how Cooler Master does it, launch, feedback, release, revised, updated chassis with all the things fixed basically. But here I would love to see the rear fan mount opened up as an optional cooling mount, so that maybe you can close it or open it depending if you want your CPU cooler chimney effect or a standard horizontal. And I would love to hear what you think about this whole thing of moving the entire power supply shroud section to the front of the case, where normally you would have some form of airflow, hard drive cages and stuff, but now it's the power supply. That's where it sits, and having all that space at the bottom for airflow and the top as well, and the back completely closed for for air pressure purposes and also noise purposes. All right, guys, that is it for me. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think of the SL600M. Make sure to check out this other relevant content, subscribe to our new boot sequence channel, and we'll see you in the next video.